We see them everywhere, most noticeably on television. They are salespersons, advertising products that are certain to improve our lives in various ways. Most notably, perhaps, are those of the red-faced variety whom voices strained from shouting and highly animated form pitch their products to us. And if you call right now, we'll double your order. How many's heard that? I love those advertisements, and it's like, oh, it's great. Sawbone it in half and scotch tape it back together and use it for the next 30 years and will it to your great-grandchildren. And I love the claims of these advertisements and the pitchmen. There are people that is just their profession. Mays was, I believe, one of them before, and perhaps you remember some of the others. I don't know if that tickles your sense of humor or not. It does mine. But it is the salesperson's job to convince us that their products are reliable and that we cannot live our lives without them. Outlandish or not, we truly are expected to believe their claims. Now, in our text this morning, Jesus is making some pretty unbelievable, if not outlandish, claims. These things I have spoken unto you, that in me you might have peace. In the world you shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. Does anybody ever struggle or have a hard time? You ever bump up against just, I know probably most of you all don't, and life's pretty smooth and like a freshly paved interstate, and it's marked reflectively, and you know where the lines are, and you can just put it in cruise control, and probably that's your experience, right? But I'm speaking for myself. Anybody ever have a hard time or run into a problem? Anybody ever struggle? Which would denote a ongoing process. Does anybody be that honest this morning? Well, let's get some help this morning, because if that is you and we have just described you, whether you're bold enough to raise your hand or not, it describes you nonetheless. If that's true, then we each one desperately need to be able to believe what Jesus said. And if we can't find relief and that cannot become our experience, and if that does not become our reality for us, then we've got to find something else that works. Truthfully, we've done just that very thing often, many times in our lives previously and before. The world's doing it even now still. Amen?
Yes.
So let's get some help this morning. In his text this morning, Jesus is making some pretty unbelievable, if not outlandish, claims. Would you agree with that? I would agree with that. Absolutely. These things I have spoken unto you, that in me you might have peace. In the world you shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I've overcome the world. How can you and I, the question we got to ask ourselves is, how can you and I be certain that the things that Jesus said are reliable? All right, the pitchman's pitching his product. All right, and he's trying to convince us, or she's trying to convince us, that their product is reliable and that we just cannot live our life without them. Well, if it's that serious from a business standpoint on television, how much more serious is it in our own lives?
That's right.
Okay, so how can we be certain that the things that Jesus said are reliable and that we cannot live our lives without Him? Is there some way that we can verify His claims? And the answer is yes. 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 You see, human experience is one of the best ways that we can measure the authenticity of the claims that Jesus made. The shared experience, we've already said that, we've attested to it, we raised our hand to this fact. The shared experience of every person, not just the ones in the room or the ones who weren't well enough to be here this morning, or the ones who have lived before, like years ago or decades ago or centuries ago or thousands of years ago, it doesn't matter. From Adam and Eve in the beginning of creation all the way back to the Garden of Eden, from that point forward, all the way, even beyond ourselves into the future, until the time that the Lord Jesus returns to take His church home. Even then, Until then, the shared experience of humanity of every single person who has ever lived is one of this. It is one of hardship and suffering. Now, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer this morning, but let's deal with the realities of life as we know them. Okay? The sacred and secular sources alike chronicle in great detail the suffering of humanity as a whole. Therefore, human experience supports the claim, and every one of us would agree, that here on earth you will have many trials and sorrows. Are we all good with that one so far? All right, well, let's get some help then. But what are the claims to give peace in the midst of our suffering? Again, do we have a way to measure that? Is there a way to know if the claims that Jesus makes are true? And again, human experience is one of the best ways to measure the authenticity of the claims that Jesus made. In Psalm 40, where's your sermon come from, preacher? Personal devotion time. Hey, would you rather have it come from personal devotion time or out of necessity to have to come up with something to fill a time slot with and then go pick and choose on your own personal pet peeve for the week? Hey, I'll go with personal devotional time any and every time. Amen? Yes. Little secret. Where's your message come from, preacher? Time spent in your personal devotions. Where am I reading at right now? Psalms. Psalm 40. Can we get that up? All right, we have the words in Psalm 40 of a man named David. It says, I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined unto me and heard my cry. He brought me up also out of an horrible pit and out of the miry clay. And he set my feet upon a rock and established my goings. And he hath put a new song in my mouth, even praise unto our God. Many shall see it and fear, and shall trust in the Lord. What most of us know about David could be summed up in two words, right? Or maybe teaching it down in the nursery right now with a lesson. No, I think it's Nehemiah rebuilding the wall, but we've taught it down there before, okay? And it's what we've heard, it's what we learned. Most of what we know about David can be summed up in two words. Goliath. What's the other one? Bathsheba, right? Kind of bookends the life of David, does it? The highs and the lows, if you will. On the one hand, the great swelling heights of an incomparable act of heroism with Goliath, and then on the other hand, you have the unimaginable depths of deceit and debauchery. However, as the scriptures present the details, the reality of David's life story reads much more like a personal tragedy. We think king, right? We think, okay, all these great things, right, to go along with it. Although a king, David suffered greatly throughout the course of his whole life. Yes. Just for example, on one occasion, he had a son. He had a son of Amnon who raped his own sister Tamar, and she was also one of David's daughters. Wow. Okay. If that wasn't enough for that situation, another son who was the brother of the sister or the daughter of David murdered the offending son, and then in turn the same son, Absalom, rebelled against David, threatened his life, and his rebellion ultimately resulted in his own murder at the hands of an overzealous military commander who just happened to be his own cousin, Joab. What a web we weave, right? Yeah. Wow. On another occasion, David lost and had a newborn infant that died. You get the idea, right? We're just getting started. We have said that the shared experience of all of us is one of hardship and suffering. But there is hardship, and then there is hardship, and there is suffering, and then there is suffering. When David spoke of suffering, he knew what he was talking about. Everybody with me? Yes. He knew what he was talking about. I haven't had any of that in my life. Well, I had one of the things in my life. We lost a child, unborn, miscarriage. So I have had something and it's bad and you don't get over it, and we didn't have any more children because of it, and the experience and the difficulties, and when you go and you pick your wife up at work and the boss says she's in the bathroom, and you go to get her and she walks all the way from the back of the building down the sidewalk, gets in the car, and you hear her sloshing with every step of that she takes, and everything that's going along with that, and so it traumatizes you, and you don't really necessarily get beyond it. If you do, it takes a very long time. But I haven't experienced all these other things, and I'll venture a guess that in your life, you haven't experienced that kind of suffering either. And if we were to brush through the account scripturally, we would find that David suffered even much more, even beyond that. And so when he spoke of suffering, he knew exactly what he was talking about. And so we have a personal endorsement from somebody who ought to know what they're talking about, right? When your pitch man comes on TV, it sounds real good. But other than what you see on there and the fact that he's very, very charismatic and has a really ability to sell something, we don't know whether there's much truth to it or not, right? But when David speaks of suffering, we have an endorsement here that we can take to the bank. Is everybody in agreement on that one? Yeah. And so if he's going to attest to the fact that God can do something in the midst of all of this thing right here, as he says in Psalm 40, verses 1 through 3, we can take it to the bank. And we can also say, if that's David's experience, it can also be our shared experience. Because it's not just a hardship and suffering that we share. We can also share the relief that can be found only in following God. Everybody with me so far? All right. David begins by saying that he waited patiently for the Lord in verse 1. Waiting for God to help us is not easy. And the seasons of suffering seem to last forever. How many knows what we're talking about? Placing all of our hope in God and believing that He is in control allows us to wait patiently and to better endure our hardship. David says that his patient waiting was rewarded. He says, I waited patiently for the Lord, and He inclined, or He turned unto me, and He heard my cry. He brought me up also out of an horrible pit and out of the miry clay. How many's heard of the book Pilgrim's Progress? Have you ever heard of that book before? Maybe you've read it, written in the 1600s. Incredible story, must read. You got to read it. It's really good. It's a fictional work, an allegory that parallels scriptural doctrine and truth. Got to read it. It's entertaining, and it's really good. It's doctrinally sound. In John Bunyan's allegory, Pilgrim's Progress, the main character, Christian, how many remember him? You read the book? He falls deeply into the slough of despond. How many remember that? Slough of despond, the old English. Christian's going along on his life journey, and he falls deeply into the slough of despond. And he has to be rescued by help. That's the name of the other character. And so can I just say to us this morning that it is from this same swamp of despair that we must all be rescued. You see, David experienced it. John Bunyan was familiar enough with it, if you know his story, that he could at least write about it knowledgeably. John Bunyan was familiar with it. David experienced it, and so do you and I. Now, in His timing, God lifted David out of his despairs. In His timing, God will lift you and I up out of our despair. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Write the sons of Korah in Psalm 140 or Psalm 46:1. In another psalm, David writes, "Weeping may endure for a night." I love this one. Weeping may endure for a night. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. I like that. Psalm 35. In times of waiting, we must resist the urge to lose hope. For when we least expect it, God will deliver us from our despair if we hold on. Still, there's always a still, isn't there? Always an addendum, isn't there? Still, we must be careful not to define God's method of delivery or the timing of His delivery, lest while looking for something else, we miss it altogether. How many knows what we're talking about? God doesn't always deliver us the way that we want Him to. He doesn't always deliver us when we want Him to. But if we're faithful and we stay the course, He always delivers us. And His ways are always better than our own. We just have to trust Him and resist the urge to abandon ship and go look for a quick fix. Who knows what we're talking about? We all know what we're talking about. That's the hard part. As a second action, David says that God set his feet on firm ground. How many would like to be set on firm ground this morning?
Yes, amen.
I want to tell you how. I want to tell you what he's talking about here, and it's not what you think. David says that God set his feet on firm ground. He brought me up also out of a horrible pit, out of the miry clay, and he set my feet upon a rock. Now, David here in this particular psalm, he doesn't say what his troubles were. David doesn't say how God delivered him. David does say that when he turned to God, God lifted him up out of his mess, and he planted him on a rock. It says in 2 Samuel 22:32, "For who is God save the Lord, and who is a rock save our God?" The rock that David was set upon was God. Not a better situation, not a brighter future necessarily, although that could be part of it as well. But the rock that David was set upon was God. And there's nothing more firm than that. He is the rock. His work is perfect, for all His ways is judgment. A God of truth and without iniquity. Just and right is He. Moses writes in Deuteronomy 32:4. Paul writes, New Testament, Old Testament preacher, well, New Testament, Paul has something very similar to write. And he even goes back and recaps the Israelite history. And he is in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. He says, "Moreover, brethren, I would not that you should be ignorant." How? That all our fathers were under the cloud. Remember, the cloud led the Israelites through the wilderness. All our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, the Red Sea, parting of the sea. And all were baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And did all eat the same spiritual meat. And did all drink the same spiritual drink. Okay, here's what you don't miss this. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Yeah. Don't miss it. Folks, I think we would all have to agree that God's ways and God works in ways that are only known to Him. But I will tell you this, Sheila, God either brings or allows everything that comes into our lives. And I will tell you this with equal certainty, there are times when God will allow hardship just to bring us back into a proper relationship with Him. There are things in our lives that can only be forged in the fiery furnace of affliction. Amen. I have refined you, but not as silver is refined. Rather, I have refined you in the furnace of suffering, it says in Isaiah chapter 48 and verse 10. The faster that we submit to what God is doing in our lives and turn fully to Him, the faster we will be delivered. The result is that He will place our feet on firm ground, not necessarily above our situation or circumstances, and listen carefully, and not above the consequences of past poor choices, but He plants us in a new reality that exists only in relationship with Him. And in that sense, there's nothing better. This does not mean, Karen, that things always turn out the way that we want them to turn out. But it does mean this. It does mean that if we turn to God in complete trust, that He will lift us up from our despair. We can stand on the firm foundation of a right relationship with Him and gain His perspective on our lives. David said that God did something else for him. He brought me up also out of a horrible pit, out of a miry clay, and He set my feet upon a rock and established my goings. What in the world is that talking about? Here's what it means. It means that He didn't just lift him up out of his present circumstances and situations, place him in a renewed right relationship with Him, and then go off to play 18 rounds somewhere. It meant that even after he did that, as David turned to Him in faith and God lifted him up out of his despair and planted him in a renewed right relationship with him, that now he came alongside of David in partnership and walked along with him through the days ahead and the future from that moment of reconciliation to steady him in his future walk. How important is that? The psalmist writes, I love this. This is on a bronze statue. I believe it's a bronze statue in the Brook Green Gardens in South Carolina, out all the way on the coast. And I saw it one time. I'll never forget it. It's beautiful. It's got this passage carved on it. And I think that this speaks to God's commitment to his children. And I think that we need to keep these words in our heart in the day in which we live, and the trials and the way and the hardships and sufferings that we endure. And it says, where shall I go from your spirit? And where am I going to go? How am I going to run? How far can I get away from you? What door can I put between us? What can I do to separate us one from another? And it says, where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there.
Yeah.
The King James Version, I like this. It says, if I make my bed in hell, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost part of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. I don't know about you, but I need that.
Yeah.
I gotta have it. I can't do without it. There's nothing else out there that can take the place of that. I gotta have that. And so do you. What does that tell us? It tells us this. It says, each and every day, every step of the way, regardless of how uncertain the way may seem to us, God is leading us right now. God is leading you right now. If you have a heart that is turned towards God, Mary, God is leading you right now. He's leading you into pathways of abundant living. He will never lead us into pathways that return us to the same old mess from which we came. God's ways are always good. Romans 8:28 says, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God. Not that are perfect, not that got it all figured out, not that have arrived at. Those like David were turned towards him in their imperfection and realized that I can't make this without you. And I can't make this about me. I have to make it all about him. And if I make it all about him in spite of where I am or what I'm doing or what I'm not, or even what I am, God will do for me what I've got to have him to do for me in the midst of my suffering and my hardships. Amen.
Amen.
Preacher, that's good. If I just only believed it. Believe it. Because God said it. God's paths are always sure. 2 Samuel 22:37 says, you have made a wide path for my feet to keep them from slipping. God is always leading us to exactly where he wants us to be. For I know the thoughts I think towards you, it says in Jeremiah chapter 29 verse 11. For I know the thoughts that I think towards you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not evil, to give you an expected end.
Yeah, man.
Surprise! I don't like surprises. Does anybody else like surprises? I don't like surprises. I don't like anything to do with surprises. And I still got to work this thing out with the Lord. Jesus is like, couldn't you just give me a little bit of headway or a little notice? I don't like surprises. I don't like surprises in any. I want to know everything that's going on. I want to know what's going to happen. I want to know how to organize it. I want to know how to put it in order. I want to know how to. I want to know how. If I'm honest about it, I want to know how to control it. Right? That's the problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But it can't work that way. God's ways are always good. God's ways are always sure, and God is always leading us exactly where he wants us to be. Even his thoughts of us are good always, and there is no evil involved. And his plans for us are to give us not a surprise in life, but to give us an expected end. When we think about that, I don't know about you all, but when I think about that, doesn't it give your heart just a little bit of a lift? If you really think, give your heart a lift and your spirit should soar. David describes it this way, and he says it right here in our psalm. He says, he hath put a new song in my mouth.
Yes.
Jeff, I think we can sing better than Jordan. What? We never sang as good as Jordan can sing right now in our dreams. But the point is this, it doesn't matter how good you sing, how good you don't sing, it doesn't matter any song you sang before. When God sets you and lifts you up and sets you on a firm foundation of a right relationship with Him, and you turn to Him with all your heart, He lifts your heart and He lifts your spirit, and He puts a new song in your mouth. A song you didn't know before. A joy that wasn't there before. A deepness of a relationship you hadn't experienced yet. Everybody with me? I don't know about you, but I'm ready for some new songs. I want some new songs. I don't want the same old, same old. I don't want to be stuck in last week even, or last year, or the year before that. I want a new song.
Yes.
I want a new song this morning. And I believe, as we said last week, His mercies are new every morning. Weeping may exist for a night, but joy comes in the morning. And so I want a new song, and God has that new song for us. There remains one final, very important truth. David's got it right up there. It's the last statement that he makes. There is one very important truth that, although often overlooked in our suffering, Chuck, we don't hardly ever think about this. I know I don't. Beginning to, but I know that I haven't, but we should. There is and remains one final, very important truth that, although often overlooked, must be understood. I'm going to tell you a story to help illustrate. On July the 4th of 1952, 34-year-old Florence Chadwick stepped into the icy cold waters of the Pacific Ocean off of Catalina Island, determined to become the first woman to swim the 21 miles to the California coast. The weather was challenging, and the day was challenging, to say the least. The fog was so thick that Florence could barely see the support boats that followed her. The tides and the currents were coming against the direction that she was swimming. While Americans watched on televisions at home, such as it was, members of her support crew fired rifles at sharks that she had attracted into the water. At about the 15-hour mark, Florence began to seriously doubt her ability to finish. When she begged to be taken out of the water, her mother, who was in a boat alongside, told her that she was close and that she believed that she could make it. After another hour of constant swimming, physically and emotionally broken Florence had to be pulled from the water. It wasn't until she was safely in the boat that she discovered that the shore was less than half a mile away. At a news conference the next day, Florence said, "All I could see was a fog. I think if I could have just seen the shore, I could have made it." Many times we feel as if life has us swimming in the worst of conditions. The current and the winds beat against us. The water is icy cold and shark infested, of that we're sure. The fog of trouble, worry, doubt, depression, health problems, financial uncertainty, and strained relationships is so thick that we cannot see the safety of shore. We began to seriously doubt seriously our ability to finish. And yet God is right there alongside us all the time. You're almost there. You can do it. I'm right here. You're almost there. You can do it. I'm right here. You're almost there. You can do it. There are blessings there are blessings that are waiting for each and every one of us on the other side of our storm. There are blessings that are waiting just out of reach for each and every one of us on the other side of our storm. The shore, in many, many cases, is less than a half a mile away. It's right there. And if we'd only known that the end was in sight, we could have made it. But we stopped. And we have to be pulled out of the waters right before we have the breakthrough. Right before we get to where God really has the good stuff for us. We have to be pulled out of the water. You're almost there. You're almost there. You can do it. There are blessings that you and I will never receive in our lives unless we go through the trials. And even beyond that, there is purpose in our suffering that transcends even our own personal interests. And that's what I want us to see lastly. And I think it was important enough that David stated it last. David said it this way: I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined unto me and heard my cry. He brought me up also out of a horrible pit, out of the miry clay, and he set my feet on a rock and established my goings, and he hath put a new song in my mouth, even praise unto our God. Many shall see it. Many shall see it and shall trust in the Lord. Sometimes our struggles have less to do with us and more to do with those who are watching to see how well we swim.
Yeah.
If we handle the adversity of life and the struggles and the hardship of life like everybody else handles them, there is nothing to recommend our God to them. I believe with all my heart, I believe with every ounce of my being that many of the times, and there is things God is working out in that furnace of affliction that are for our own personal benefit, and I believe that those are primarily what's going on when we face hardship and we have hard times and we struggle and we have troubles and trials. I believe primarily God is purifying and he is taking us to our next promised land, if you will, and I believe that that's the primary purpose. But I also believe that sometimes our struggles have less to do with us and more to do with those who are watching to see how we're going to handle it. A lot of conversations are generated. We talk about sharing our faith all the time. Can I tell you the number one obstacle that we've got to sharing our faith in a believable fashion? We're talking about selling things this morning, right? And pitchmen and products and statements of Jesus and believability and all this kind of stuff. Can I tell you what our number one obstacle to effectively sharing our faith is? Our actions don't line up with our lips.
That's right.
That's right.
And so when we share our faith, we are as one who is unbelievable. What? I don't get it. How does it? I've seen you. I know you. I know you. I'm having trouble buying what you're pitching.
Right.
But when you swim well in the icy water and it's shark infested and people are shooting guns all around you, which will have to unnerve anybody, and all these things are going on and you continue to swim well. You talking about having an effective witness, and you talking about generating some conversations, and you talking about having some captive audiences. What is it? What is it? I got to know. You know why? Because you can't find what we find in those situations anywhere else. There's no amount of deceit. Michael, you're a painter. There's no amount of paint going to paint that one up to sell it. Because anybody can see the difference.
Yeah.
And there's no amount of deceit or paint or anything else that I hide the difference in the life of a person who goes through their hardships and their trials and they depend on the Lord Jesus Christ in the process. There's something just different about that person. in the face of mounting evidence of human experience, and we've all had it in the past, and we've shared this experience in the past. In the face of mounting evidence of human experience, of the human experience variety, the question becomes not, can Jesus be trusted, but will I trust he who alone can only be trusted, and he can be trusted. Let's trust him.